Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The November fog lay thick upon London that morning, pressing against the windows of 291B Baker Street like some grey, suffocating shroud. Dr. Watson sat by the fire, observing with that mixture of concern and anticipation which had become familiar to him during his years with Sherlock Holmes, the restless energy that seized his friend during periods of enforced idleness. Holmes had spent the better part of 3 days in a state of barely contained agitation, alternating between violent exercises upon his violin and lengthy dissertations upon the criminal tendencies of various tobacco ashes, subjects which, while fascinating to their originator, had begun to wear thin upon both Watson's patience and Mrs. Hudson's tolerance. It was with considerable relief, therefore, that both men heard the urgent rap of knuckles upon their door, followed by the hurried ascent of footsteps upon the 17 stairs. Inspector Lestrade entered without ceremony, his lean figure cutting a damp silhouette against the gaslight of the hallway, his usually composed features bearing the unmistakable marks of a man confronted by circumstances that defied all reasonable explanation. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, shaking the moisture from his coat with sharp, irritated movements, "I have come to you with a case that has left every man at the Yard scratching his head in bewilderment. It concerns the death of Sir Reginald Blackwood at his estate in Hampstead, and I'll be hanged if I can make sense of it." Holmes, who had been slouched in his chair with the air of a man resigned to terminal boredom, straightened perceptibly at these words. Watson observed the familiar transformation that occurred whenever a new puzzle presented itself, the sharpening of those keen grey eyes, the slight forward inclination of the head like a hound catching the first scent of game. "Death, you say, Lestrade?" Holmes murmured, his long fingers already reaching for his pipe. "And what manner of death has so thoroughly confounded the Metropolitan Police?" "That's just it, Mr. Holmes. It appears to be perfectly natural. Sir Reginald was found yesterday morning in his study, seated at his desk as though he had simply fallen asleep over his papers. The family physician, Dr. Mortimer, examined the body and pronounced it a failure of the heart. The man was 68 years old and had suffered from a weak constitution for some time. Under ordinary circumstances there would be nothing to investigate." "But these were not ordinary circumstances," Watson ventured, recognizing the familiar pattern of Lestrade's presentations. "Indeed not, Doctor. You see, when Sir Reginald's valet discovered the body at 8 o'clock yesterday morning, he found the study door locked from the inside. The key was in Sir Reginald's waistcoat pocket, and there was no other means of entry. The windows were latched from within, and they face a sheer drop to the garden terrace 30 feet below." Holmes waved his hand dismissively. "A locked room and a natural death, Inspector. Surely such circumstances, while regrettable, are hardly unprecedented. What brings you to Baker Street on this foggy morning?" Lestrade's weathered face grew grim. "The footprints, Mr. Holmes. In the carpet, around Sir Reginald's desk, clearly impressed into the thick Persian weave, were the marks of a man's boots. Heavy boots, much larger than anything Sir Reginald could have worn, for he was a small man with correspondingly small feet, and these footprints, Mr. Holmes, formed a perfect circle around his chair, as though someone had walked round and round him as he sat there." The effect of these words upon Holmes was immediate and pronounced. He set down his pipe and leaned forward in his chair, his entire being focused upon the inspector's account with an intensity that Watson had rarely witnessed. "How many circuits?" Holmes asked quietly. "At least 4 complete revolutions, possibly more. The impressions were quite clear. A man's boot, size 10 or 11, with a distinctive wear pattern on the right heel. The housekeeper swears the carpet was pristine when she cleaned the room the evening before Sir Reginald's death, and yet there they were, clear as if stamped by a die." "And you are certain the room was secured from within?" "Absolutely certain. I examined every inch of that study myself, Mr. Holmes. One door, locked from the inside with the key in the deceased's possession. 2 windows, both latched from within and facing an impossible drop. The walls are solid stone, part of the original Tudor construction, and the ceiling shows no signs of disturbance. Yet someone walked in circles around that desk and then vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Holmes rose abruptly and began to pace the length of their sitting room, his hands clasped behind his back in that attitude of intense concentration which Watson knew so well. The fog pressed against their windows with renewed vigour, as though London itself were holding its breath in anticipation of the great detective's response. "Tell me, Lestrade," Holmes said without breaking his stride, "what was Sir Reginald's state of mind in the days preceding his death? Had he seemed troubled by anything in particular?" His nephew, Mr. James Blackwood, mentioned that the old gentleman had been somewhat agitated of late. He had taken to locking himself in his study for hours at a time, and had dismissed the servants from that wing of the house after 6 o'clock each evening. Most unusually, he had also requested that additional locks be installed on his study door just 1 week before his death. Additional locks? Holmes paused in his pacing, his eyebrows arching with interest. 2 new deadbolts installed by a locksmith from Hampstead Village. Sir Reginald supervised the work personally and retained all the keys. The locks were found secure the morning of his death, and the keys were in his possession. Holmes resumed his restless movement about the room, and Watson could see that the problem had captured his imagination completely. The locked room, the mysterious circular footprints, the victim's recent precautions, all combined to present exactly the sort of puzzle that his friend found irresistible. "You mentioned that Sir Reginald was found at his desk," Holmes continued. "Was he engaged in any particular activity at the time of his death?" "He appeared to have been writing, though whatever document he was working on has disappeared. There was an ink-stained blotter on the desk, and his pen had fallen from his hand. But no letter or paper of any kind could be found in the room." "Most intriguing." Holmes moved to the window and stood gazing out at the fog-shrouded street below, his sharp profile etched against the pale light. "Watson, I believe our morning has taken a decidedly more interesting turn. Lestrade, if you would be so kind as to arrange transportation, I should very much like to examine this impossible room and its mysterious circular evidence before any more well-meaning constables have the opportunity to disturb the scene." "Then you'll take the case, Mr. Holmes?" Relief was evident in the inspector's voice. "Indeed I shall." Holmes turned from the window with that slight smile which Watson had learned to associate with the beginning of their most challenging adventures. A locked room, a natural death, and footprints that walk in circles. Such a combination demands investigation. Besides, it has been far too long since London has provided me with a puzzle worthy of serious consideration. As Lestrade hurried away to secure a cab, Holmes moved to his desk and began gathering the tools of his trade, magnifying glass, measuring tape, and the small leather case containing his various chemical apparatus. The fog outside seemed to press more insistently against their windows, as though the very city were conspiring to shroud this new mystery in deeper shadow. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" Watson asked, reaching for his own coat and medical bag. "At present, my dear fellow, I make nothing of it at all, which is precisely what makes it so fascinating. Footprints that describe perfect circles, rooms that are locked from within yet somehow entered, and victims who die natural deaths under the most unnatural circumstances. It promises to be a most educational morning." The sound of wheels upon wet cobblestones announced the arrival of their conveyance, and within moments the 2 men were seated in a hansom cab, rolling through the fog-bound streets toward Hampstead, and whatever secrets awaited them in Sir Reginald Blackwood's impossible study. Watson settled back against the leather seat and watched his friend's keen profile as Holmes gazed out at the passing shadows of London, his mind already racing ahead to grapple with the enigma of the footsteps that walked in circles. The hansom cab rattled through the fog-shrouded streets of North London, its wheels finding purchase on the slick cobblestones with that peculiar rhythm which the dampness seemed to amplify. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the pale gaslight filtering through the mist, while Watson found himself studying his friend's expression for some hint of the thoughts that were undoubtedly already organizing themselves into that methodical framework which had solved so many seemingly impossible puzzles. As they climbed the winding road toward Hampstead Heath, Holmes suddenly turned his attention to his companion with that slight smile which invariably preceded one of his casual demonstrations of observation. "I see, Watson, that young Timothy Morrison has made a complete recovery from his fever. The absence of iodine stains upon your cuff, combined with the unhurried manner in which you donned your coat this morning, suggests that your night calls have ceased and the crisis has passed." Watson chuckled, for indeed the child had turned the corner just 2 days prior, and Holmes's deduction was, as always, perfectly accurate. Blackwood Manor emerged from the mist like some Gothic apparition, its Tudor chimneys and Georgian additions creating an architectural palimpsest that spoke of centuries of family history. The estate was substantial, clearly the seat of considerable wealth, with formal gardens stretching away into the grey distance, and ancient oaks standing sentinel along the gravel drive. A solemn butler admitted them to a panelled hall where the very air seemed weighted with recent tragedy, and it was here that they encountered Mr. James Blackwood, Sir Reginald's nephew and heir. James Blackwood was a man of perhaps 35 years, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, though Watson noted the strain evident in his pale complexion and the slight tremor in his hands as he greeted them. There was something in his manner, a carefully controlled anxiety that suggested grief mixed with other, less easily defined emotions. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice carrying the measured courtesy of a gentleman accustomed to social obligations, "I cannot express my gratitude that you have agreed to investigate these most peculiar circumstances. While Dr. Mortimer assures us that Uncle Reginald died of natural causes, the mysterious nature of his final hours has left the entire household in considerable distress." Holmes acknowledged the introduction with characteristic brevity, his keen eyes already surveying their surroundings with that penetrating gaze which missed nothing of significance. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand that your uncle had become increasingly reclusive in recent weeks. Can you elaborate upon his state of mind during this period?" "Uncle Reginald had always valued his privacy, Mr. Holmes, but his behaviour in recent weeks had become quite extraordinary. He dismissed all servants from the East, wing after 6 each evening, insisting upon absolute solitude for what he termed matters of the utmost importance. He would remain locked in his study until well past midnight, taking his meals there and refusing all callers." "What manner of work could have demanded such secrecy?" Watson inquired, noting how James Blackwood's eyes flickered momentarily toward the upper floors before returning to meet his gaze. "That is precisely what makes this so puzzling, Doctor. Uncle Reginald had been retired from active business for nearly 5 years. His recent interests had centered primarily upon historical research and the cataloguing of family papers, hardly work that would require such extraordinary precautions. Lestrade, who had been growing visibly impatient during these preliminaries, cleared his throat decisively. "If we might proceed to the study, gentlemen, the scene remains exactly as it was discovered, and I am most anxious to hear Mr. Holmes's observations." They followed James Blackwood through a series of corridors toward the east wing, their footsteps echoing hollowly in the hushed atmosphere. The house seemed to press in around them, its shadows deepened by the fog that had somehow penetrated even these interior spaces. At length they arrived before a heavy oak door marked by 3 gleaming brass locks, evidence of Sir Reginald's recent security measures. "The study lies beyond," James Blackwood murmured, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "Inspector Lestrade has maintained a guard to ensure nothing has been disturbed." Holmes paused at the threshold, his hand resting upon the doorframe, and Watson observed that familiar transformation which occurred whenever his friend encountered a fresh mystery. The restless energy that had characterized his behavior at Baker Street was replaced by an almost predatory stillness, his entire being focused upon the puzzle that awaited them with the intensity of a master craftsman approaching his most challenging work. "Before we enter," Holmes said quietly, "I should like to understand the precise sequence of events yesterday morning, the discovery of the body, the condition of the locks, the first observations of those mysterious footprints. Every detail may prove significant." James Blackwood steadied himself against the doorframe, his composure returning, as he prepared to recount the disturbing events that had shattered the morning calm. "Henderson, my uncle's valet, arrived at his customary hour of 7:30 to deliver the morning tea service. When his knocks received no response, which was most unusual given Uncle Reginald's punctual habits, Henderson grew concerned and summoned me from the breakfast room." The young man's voice carried the controlled tension of someone reliving a profound shock. "We called through the door for nearly 10 minutes, our alarm growing with each moment of absolute silence. The new deadbolts made our usual recourse impossible. Uncle Reginald had retained all the keys, and our master set would not serve. Finally, with the assistance of 2 footmen, we were obliged to remove the door entirely by lifting out the hinge pins, as the locks remained firmly engaged even with the frame damaged." Holmes listened with that peculiar stillness which indicated his complete absorption in every detail. "The keys, Mr. Blackwood. Inspector Lestrade mentioned they were found upon your uncle's person. Can you be more specific as to their precise location?" "2 were discovered in his waistcoat pocket, Mr. Holmes, while the third, the key to the original lock, was clutched so tightly in his right hand that Dr. Mortimer was obliged to pry his fingers open to retrieve it. The grip was remarkably firm for a man who had passed peacefully in his sleep." This detail seemed to strike Holmes with particular significance, for he stepped back from the damaged doorway and regarded the splintered wood with renewed interest. Watson observed his friend's keen gaze travelling from the forced hinges to the intact locks as though reading some narrative written in brass and oak that escaped ordinary observation. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, then turned to address the group with characteristic directness. "Gentlemen, we shall now examine the scene itself, but I must insist upon the utmost care. Evidence, once disturbed, cannot be restored, and I fear too many well-intentioned observers may have already compromised crucial details." The study door swung open to reveal a chamber that spoke eloquently of its owner's scholarly pursuits. Tall bookcases lined the walls, their leather-bound volumes creating an atmosphere of learned contemplation, while heavy curtains framed windows that faced the fog-shrouded garden beyond. The air carried that distinctive mixture of old paper, leather bindings, and cold pipe tobacco that belongs to rooms devoted to serious intellectual work, though Watson detected beneath these familiar scents something else, a faint, metallic tang that seemed oddly out of place in such surroundings. At the room's centre stood Sir Reginald Blackwood, still seated at his massive mahogany desk as though death had merely interrupted his evening's work. His head rested upon his folded arms, his fine-boned hands still positioned near an ink-stained blotter, while his half-moon spectacles had slipped slightly down his nose. The scene might have suggested nothing more than an elderly scholar who had dozed over his papers, were it not for the extraordinary evidence impressed into the rich Persian carpet surrounding his chair. Holmes approached this central mystery with the methodical precision that characterized all his investigations. He first examined the 3 locks on the inner surface of the door, his gloved fingers tracing the polished brass of the deadbolts before turning his attention to the original mechanism. Producing his magnifying glass, he studied each keyhole and the surrounding woodwork, with microscopic care, searching for any trace of tampering or forced entry that might have escaped casual observation. "The locks show no signs of interference," he announced quietly, then moved to the tall windows that faced the garden. He tested each latch, confirmed their security, and leaned out to examine the sheer drop to the terrace 30 feet below. The windows remain undisturbed, and the approach from outside would be impossible for any ordinary mortal. Finally, Holmes turned his attention to the heart of the enigma. He circled the desk with deliberate slowness, his keen eyes fixed upon the carpet where the mysterious footprints formed their perfect circle around Sir Reginald's chair. Each impression was clearly defined in the thick pile, showing the outline of a heavy boot considerably larger than anything the deceased could have worn. The spacing between the prints was remarkably uniform, suggesting not the random pacing of an agitated visitor, but the measured tread of someone walking with deliberate purpose. Holmes dropped to his knees beside the carpet, his magnifying glass hovering over the impressions as he studied every detail of their formation. 4 complete circuits, he observed, his voice barely above a whisper, with the beginning of a 5th. Note the depth and clarity, Watson. These were made by someone moving slowly and deliberately, not hurriedly. The pressure is consistent, the intervals precise. He paused at one particular impression near the desk leg, his glass focusing intently on some detail that escaped the observation of his companions. For a moment his expression sharpened with what might have been recognition, though he made no comment upon whatever had caught his attention. Rising from his examination of the carpet, Holmes moved to the desk itself, where he studied the ink-stained blotter with particular care. Lifting it to catch the pale light from the windows, he held it at various angles until certain impressions became visible in relief. "Interesting," he murmured, producing a sheet of thin paper to capture the reversed writing that had pressed through from above. "The fragments are incomplete, but I can make out certain words: codicil, trust, James, and what appears to be Monday." James Blackwood's face tightened almost imperceptibly at these revelations, though his voice remained steady as he explained. Uncle Reginald had mentioned his intention to revise certain family settlements. He spoke of it perhaps a fortnight ago, though he did not confide the particulars of his plans. Holmes nodded absently, his attention already shifting to other aspects of the mystery. He opened the desk drawers systematically, examining their contents with characteristic thoroughness, though he found nothing more illuminating than the usual correspondence and financial records of a retired gentleman. It was when he reached the final drawer that his hand paused over a small brass fitting, the sort that might terminate a decorative cord, before closing the drawer without comment. "There is one more element that demands our attention," Holmes announced, moving toward a section of the bookcase where Watson now noticed the outline of a wall safe, its steel door barely visible behind a row of volumes. "This safe, Mr. Blackwood, when was it last opened?" "I cannot say with certainty, Mr. Holmes. Uncle Reginald was most particular about his private papers, and I would not presume to inquire into his personal affairs." Holmes examined the safe's combination dial through his magnifying glass, noting what appeared to be faint traces of chalk dust on several of the numerals. "Someone with dusty fingers has been attentive to this mechanism recently," he observed, though he made no attempt to manipulate the lock. "We shall leave it undisturbed for the present." The great detective straightened and surveyed the entire scene once more, his sharp gaze moving from the circular footprints to the locked safe, from the damaged door to the peaceful figure of Sir Reginald Blackwood. The pieces of the puzzle lay before them, each element clear and distinct, yet their connection remained as elusive as the fog that pressed against the study windows. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes said finally, his voice carrying that note of authority which indicated the beginning of serious investigation, "I shall require you to summon every male member of this household for the examination of their footwear. Additionally, I must insist that you dispatch a constable to interview the locksmith who installed those deadbolts. The answers we seek may lie not in what we observe, but in what has been carefully concealed from our observation." Lestrade departed with characteristic efficiency, and within the span of an hour had assembled every male member of the household staff in the servants' hall below. The procession that returned to the study included Henderson the valet, whose dignified bearing spoke of decades in distinguished service; Mullins the head gardener, a weathered man whose calloused hands told of years spent among the estate's carefully tended grounds; two footmen whose polished appearance reflected the high standards of the household; and finally James Blackwood himself, who had volunteered to submit to the examination with an air of cooperative resignation that Watson found somehow less than entirely convincing. Holmes approached this task with the methodical precision that characterized all his investigations, examining each man's footwear with the same intensity he might have devoted to a rare manuscript or a delicate chemical experiment. Henderson's soft-soled shoes, appropriate to his station as a gentleman's personal attendant, bore no resemblance to the heavy impressions in the carpet. The footman's boots, while substantial, were clearly too small to have created the mysterious circular track, and their wear patterns showed none of the distinctive characteristics that might link them to the crime scene. It was when Holmes reached Mullins that his examination grew more intensive. The gardener's boots were of the proper size, and the right heel showed a curious beveled wear that caught the detective's immediate attention. Holmes studied this particular detail through his magnifying glass, comparing it mentally to the impressions he had observed in the study carpet, before straightening with an expression of thoughtful consideration. "The size is consistent," he announced quietly to Lestrade, "and the heel wear corresponds to what we observed upstairs. However," he continued, kneeling beside one of the clearer impressions in the carpet and applying his glass to the fibres, "observe this curious detail, Watson. The carpet pile contains traces of a fine white powder distributed only within the outline of the footprints themselves." Watson bent to examine the evidence his friend indicated, noting indeed the faint chalky residue that clung to the Persian weave. "Remarkable, Holmes. How does such material come to be present in the impressions but nowhere else in the room?" "An excellent question, my dear fellow, and one that suggests these marks were created under most unusual circumstances." Holmes rose and moved to the tall window, where he examined the blind cord with renewed interest. "Mrs. Green mentioned a missing finial from this very cord, did she not? A small brass weight that disappeared 3 days ago." James Blackwood, who had been observing these proceedings with growing unease, stepped forward as Holmes turned his attention to him. "Mr. Holmes, surely you cannot suspect me of involvement in my uncle's death? The very suggestion is preposterous." "I suspect nothing at present, Mr. Blackwood, though I observe everything." "Your boots, if you would be so kind." The young heir's footwear proved to be of excellent quality, well maintained and bearing the subtle signs of regular use by a gentleman accustomed to walking the grounds of a substantial estate. Holmes examined them with the same meticulous care he had devoted to the others, though Watson noticed that his friend's attention lingered particularly upon the right heel, where a distinctive wear pattern was clearly visible. "Size 11, Holmes murmured, "and note this particular abrasion along the outer edge of the right heel, Watson. The pattern is quite distinctive, suggesting a slight favouring of one side during walking." Lestrade's eyes brightened with professional interest as he observed the apparent match between James Blackwood's boot and the mysterious impressions. "Mr. Blackwood, can you account for your whereabouts yesterday evening, between 6 o'clock and midnight?" "Certainly, Inspector. I dined with my fiancée, Miss Eleanor Vance, at her family residence in Belgravia. We spent the entire evening there, and I did not return to Blackwood Manor until nearly midnight, entering through the servants' entrance to avoid disturbing the household." "And you were observed during this time?" "Miss Vance and her parents can attest to my presence throughout the evening. I arrived at 7 o'clock precisely, and departed at 11:30. Holmes had been listening to this exchange with that peculiar stillness which Watson had learned to associate with his friend's most intensive mental processes. Now he straightened and regarded the assembled company with an expression that seemed to combine satisfaction with a deeper, more complex understanding. "Inspector Lestrade," he said finally, "while the evidence certainly appears to point in a particular direction, I must caution against premature conclusions. There is something distinctly theatrical about these circular footprints, a precision and deliberateness that strikes me as rather too perfect for a clandestine, nocturnal visit." Watson observed the subtle interplay of expressions that crossed the faces of their companions at these words. Lestrade's eagerness to proceed with an arrest was clearly tempered by his respect for Holmes's judgment, while James Blackwood's relief at this unexpected reprieve was equally evident, though tinged with an anxiety that seemed to run deeper than mere concern for his reputation. At this moment, the constable whom Lestrade had dispatched to interview the locksmith returned with information that added yet another layer to the mystery. Mr. Thornbury, the craftsman who had installed Sir Reginald's additional security measures, reported that the elderly gentleman had been most particular about every aspect of the work, insisting upon the finest mechanisms available and personally supervising each step of the installation. Most significantly, the constable reported, Sir Reginald required that 6 keys be cut in total, 3 for each of the 2 new deadbolts, and he retained all 6 keys in his personal possession. Mr. Thornbury mentioned that Sir Reginald seemed particularly concerned about the possibility of unauthorized duplication, even going so far as to collect all metal filings and waste material from the key-cutting process. Holmes's eyebrows arched with unmistakable interest at this intelligence. 6 keys for 2 locks. That degree of precaution suggests a man who feared a very specific and immediate threat. What else did Mr. Thornbury observe about Sir Reginald's state of mind? The locksmith described him as increasingly agitated during the installation, frequently checking the windows and asking whether the work could be completed more quickly. He also inquired repeatedly about the strength of the mechanisms and whether they could be forced from the outside. Most illuminating. Holmes began pacing the length of the study once more, his keen gaze moving from the circular footprints to the damaged door, from the locked safe to the peaceful figure of Sir Reginald Blackwood. We have before us a man who took extraordinary precautions against some anticipated danger, who died apparently of natural causes in a room secured by 3 separate locks, yet whose final hours were somehow witnessed by someone who walked in perfect circles around his desk before vanishing as completely as morning mist. The fog outside pressed more insistently against the study windows, as though the very atmosphere of London were conspiring to shroud this mystery in deeper shadow. Watson found himself studying the faces of their companions, noting the various degrees of tension and anxiety that marked each countenance, while Holmes continued his restless movement about the room with that air of a man grappling with a puzzle whose solution lay tantalizingly just beyond his grasp. "There is one more element that demands our immediate attention," Holmes announced suddenly, moving toward the wall, safe with renewed purpose. "Inspector Lestrade, I believe the time has come to examine the contents of this safe. Whatever drove Sir Reginald to such extraordinary security measures in his final week may well be concealed behind that steel door, and I suspect that the answers we seek lie not in what we can observe, but in what has been deliberately hidden from our view." James Blackwood's reluctance to authorize the opening of his uncle's private safe was evident in the tightening of his jaw and the slight tremor that passed through his hands, though he ultimately acquiesced with the resigned air of a man who recognized the inevitable. Holmes approached the steel mechanism with that peculiar combination of delicacy and confidence which characterized all his technical endeavors, kneeling before the polished dial as though it were some ancient oracle whose secrets required the proper incantation to unlock. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, producing his magnifying glass to examine the combination dial with a microscopic precision. "The faint traces of chalk dust I noted earlier are not distributed randomly across the numerals, but concentrated upon specific digits. A nervous man repeatedly working the same combination leaves such telltale signs as surely as footprints in fresh snow." With methodical care, Holmes began to manipulate the dial, his movements guided by the nearly invisible residue that clung to the numbers 2, 7, 1, and 8. His long fingers moved with surgical precision, first right, then left, each click of the internal mechanism echoing through the hushed study like small thunderclaps. The assembled company watched in fascination as the great detective's deductive methods transformed what might have required hours of professional safe-cracking into a matter of minutes. The final tumbler fell into place with a satisfying click, and Holmes swung open the heavy steel door to reveal the ordered accumulation of Sir Reginald's most private concerns. Within lay several bundles of correspondence tied with green ribbon, a leather-bound ledger whose pages showed evidence of recent and frequent consultation, and most significantly a sealed envelope bearing the inscription "To be opened only upon my death" in Sir Reginald's distinctive hand. Holmes extracted each item with characteristic care, arranging them upon the desk in order of apparent importance. The correspondence proved to contain routine business matters and family communications, though Watson noted that several letters bore the seal of Whitmore and Associates, Sir Reginald's longtime solicitors. The ledger, however, revealed a more troubling narrative of financial concerns and family tensions that had clearly been weighing heavily upon the deceased's mind in his final weeks. "Most illuminating," Holmes observed, scanning the ledger's recent entries with practiced efficiency. "It appears that Sir Reginald had discovered certain irregularities in the family finances, specifically regarding unauthorized use of the Blackwood name to secure credit from various London establishments. The amounts involved are not inconsiderable." James Blackwood's complexion had grown noticeably paler during this recitation, though his voice remained steady as he responded. "Uncle Reginald was always meticulous about financial matters, Mr. Holmes. If he harbored concerns about my personal affairs, he never saw fit to discuss them with me directly." Holmes turned his attention to the sealed envelope, which James accepted with hands that trembled slightly despite his efforts at composure. As the young heir broke the wax seal and unfolded the document within, Watson observed the play of emotions across his features: surprise, dismay, and what might have been relief all flickering in rapid succession across his pale countenance. "It appears to be a codicil to Uncle Reginald's will," James announced, though his voice carried a note of strain that had been absent from his earlier responses. "Certain modifications to the trust arrangements, nothing that would materially affect the investigation." Holmes, however, had been observing James Blackwood's reactions with that penetrating attention which missed no detail of human behaviour. "Indeed? And does this codicil, by any chance, reference the mysterious document that was being prepared at this very desk on the evening of your uncle's death? The fragments we observed on the blotter mentioned both codicil and Monday, did they not?" While this exchange continued, Holmes had moved to examine other contents of the safe, including a small cylindrical container labelled French chalk in Sir Reginald's neat script. He lifted this item with particular interest, noting that it had been recently used, then turned his attention to a length of braided cord wound around a wooden bobbin, its end neatly finished but showing signs of recent cutting. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, drawing his friend's attention to these discoveries, "observe this cord and its severed terminus. Combined with the missing brass finial from the window blind, it suggests preparations for some mechanical contrivance that required both weight and precise measurement." Moving from the safe to the desk itself, Holmes began a more intensive examination of its construction, eventually lying upon his back to study the underside of the heavy mahogany surface. From this awkward position, he retrieved what appeared to be a minute brass shaving and a small splinter of wood showing a freshly cut groove, both of which he deposited in his waistcoat pocket with an air of satisfaction. "The evidence begins to suggest a most ingenious mechanism," Holmes announced as he rose and dusted off his coat, "though its precise nature and purpose remain tantalizingly obscure." Inspector Lestrade, while the motive for Sir Reginald's death appears increasingly clear, "I must caution against any precipitate conclusions regarding the method by which it was accomplished." Lestrade, whose patience with Holmes's methodical approach was wearing thin, gestured toward the circular footprints that dominated the carpet around Sir Reginald's chair. "Surely, Mr. Holmes, the evidence speaks for itself. We have clear motive in the form of financial irregularities and threatened disinheritance, opportunity in the form of duplicate keys or inside knowledge, and physical proof in those footprints that match Mr. Blackwood's boots exactly." "The match is indeed instructive," Holmes replied with that slight smile which indicated his awareness of subtleties that escaped ordinary observation, "though perhaps not in the fashion you suppose. There is something distinctly theatrical about the precision of those circular impressions, Inspector, something that suggests careful preparation rather than the spontaneous actions of a desperate heir." Holmes moved once more to examine the mysterious footprints, kneeling beside them with his magnifying glass to study details that had escaped previous observation. "Note, Watson, how the chalk dust we discovered in the safe appears also within these impressions, distributed with remarkable uniformity throughout their outline. This suggests that whoever created these marks had recently handled the same substance that Sir Reginald used to detect unauthorized attempts upon his combination lock." The implications of this observation sent a visible shock through James Blackwood, whose carefully maintained composure finally began to crack under the weight of accumulating evidence. Yet Holmes seemed more intrigued than satisfied by these revelations, his keen gaze moving from the footprints to the severed cord, from the brass shavings to the missing document, as though all these elements formed part of some larger pattern that remained frustratingly incomplete. "There is something distinctly artificial about this entire tableau," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. "The evidence is too perfectly arranged, too conveniently discovered, too obviously pointing toward a single conclusion. In my experience, Watson, When a mystery appears to solve itself with such obliging clarity, it is wise to suspect that we are being invited to draw conclusions that may prove as illusory as morning mist. The fog outside had grown so dense that the study windows appeared almost opaque, lending an otherworldly quality to the scene as Holmes continued his examination of the evidence. Watson found himself studying the faces of their companions, noting the various degrees of tension and anxiety that marked each countenance, while the great detective's warning about premature conclusions hung in the air like a challenge to conventional logic. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes announced finally, "I believe we have gathered sufficient evidence for the present, though I fear the true solution to this mystery lies not in what we have discovered, but in what has been deliberately concealed from our observation. I shall require the remainder of the day to conduct certain experiments at Baker Street, after which I believe we shall be in a position to understand not merely who walked in those mysterious circles, but why such an elaborate deception was deemed necessary." The return journey to Baker Street passed in that peculiar silence which Watson had learned to associate with his friends' most intensive periods of mental activity. Holmes sat opposite him in the hansom cab, his keen gaze fixed upon some invisible point beyond the fog-shrouded streets, his long fingers occasionally moving as though manipulating some complex mechanism that existed only in the laboratory of his mind. The rhythmic clatter of wheels upon wet cobblestones provided a steady accompaniment to Watson's own reflections upon the morning's discoveries, each piece of evidence seeming to suggest multiple interpretations that refused to coalesce into a coherent whole. Upon reaching their lodgings, Holmes immediately transformed their familiar sitting room into an experimental laboratory with that methodical efficiency which characterized all his investigations. From various drawers and cabinets, he assembled an impressive array of materials: a length of cord procured from Mrs. Hudson's sewing basket, a brass paperweight to substitute for the missing finial, a sample of French chalk from his chemical supplies, and, most significantly, a pair of worn boots whose broad soles bore a striking resemblance to the impressions they had observed in Sir Reginald's study. "Watson," Holmes announced as he began arranging these items upon the central table, "I propose to demonstrate that a man need not walk to leave a man's footprints. Observe most carefully the mechanism I am about to construct." With surgical precision, Holmes attached the brass weight to one end of the cord, then secured the other end beneath the heavy leg of their center table, adjusting the length until the weight hung at precisely the distance they had measured from Sir Reginald's desk to the mysterious circular track. He then dusted one of the boots liberally with chalk, ensuring that every ridge and depression of the sole was thoroughly coated with the fine white powder. The demonstration that followed was both elegant and revelatory. Holmes guided the weighted cord in a slow, deliberate arc, allowing the chalked boot to press against the carpet at regular intervals as it traced a perfect circle around the table leg. Each impression was uniform in depth and spacing, creating a pattern that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the mysterious evidence they had discovered at Blackwood Manor. "You perceive, my dear fellow," Holmes said with evident satisfaction, "that the mechanical precision of these impressions far exceeds what any human walker could achieve, even under the most controlled circumstances. Note, particularly, how the chalk dust concentrates within each footprint, while scarcely extending beyond its boundaries, exactly as we observed in Sir Reginald's study." Watson studied the miniature reproduction with growing admiration for his friend's deductive capabilities. The perfect regularity of the circular track, the uniform distribution of the chalk residue, and most significantly, the complete absence of any connecting footprints between the impressions all combined to suggest a mechanical contrivance rather than human agency. The beauty of this particular deception, Holmes continued, dismantling his experimental apparatus with characteristic economy of movement, lies in its theatrical perfection. Someone wished to create the impression of a mysterious nocturnal visitor, while ensuring that no actual human presence could be detected within that locked room. The weighted cord, properly positioned and released at the appropriate moment, would continue to swing in diminishing circles for several hours, gradually coming to rest in a manner that would leave no trace of the mechanism itself. At this moment, Mrs. Hudson's familiar step upon the stair announced the arrival of a visitor, and within moments Dr. Mortimer appeared at their door, his professional bearing somewhat compromised by an evident state of considerable agitation. The physician's usually steady hand showed a slight tremor as he accepted Watson's offer of a chair, and his carefully composed features bore the unmistakable marks of a man wrestling with professional doubts of the most serious nature. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began without preamble, "I have come to you with information that may materially affect your investigation into Sir Reginald Blackwood's death. After considerable reflection upon the circumstances surrounding my examination of the deceased, I have begun to harbour certain doubts about the thoroughness of my initial conclusions." Holmes turned from his experimental table with that quickening of interest which indicated his recognition of a significant development. "Indeed, Dr. Mortimer, and what specific observations have prompted this reconsideration of your professional opinion?" "Several factors, Mr. Holmes, which individually might be dismissed as insignificant, but which collectively suggest that my examination may have been less comprehensive than the circumstances demanded." Dr. Mortimer's voice carried the measured precision of a man accustomed to medical testimony, though Watson detected an underlying current of professional anxiety. First, there was the unusual rigidity of Sir Reginald's right hand, which required considerable force to open and retrieve the key he clutched so tightly. In my experience, such muscular tension is uncommon in cases of simple cardiac failure. Holmes leaned forward in his chair, his entire attention focused upon their visitor's account. "What other observations have troubled your professional conscience, Doctor?" The condition of Sir Reginald's fingernails showed minute traces of what appeared to be chalk dust or plaster residue, though there was no construction work in progress at the manor. Additionally, I detected a faint but distinctive odour about the deceased, not unpleasant, but somehow artificial, as though he had been in contact with some chemical compound in his final hours. Watson exchanged a meaningful glance with Holmes, both men recognizing the potential significance of these revelations. The chalk dust they had discovered in the safe and among the mysterious footprints now took on an entirely different meaning, suggesting not merely the tools of deception, but possibly the means of murder itself. "Most significantly," Dr. Mortimer continued, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone, "I have since consulted several medical texts regarding exotic toxins that might produce symptoms resembling natural heart failure. There are certain rare compounds derived from tropical plants or mineral sources that leave few traces in the human system, yet can produce rapid cardiac arrest in elderly individuals with pre-existing conditions." Holmes rose from his chair and began that restless pacing, which indicated his mind was already several steps ahead of the immediate conversation. "Dr. Mortimer, I believe your professional instincts have served you admirably in prompting this visit. Would you be prepared to conduct a more thorough post-mortem examination with particular attention to the possibility of poisoning by some exotic compound that might escape conventional detection?" "I had reached the same conclusion, Mr. Holmes. With the family's permission, I should be prepared to conduct such an examination this very evening, utilizing certain specialized tests that were not employed during my initial examination." As Dr. Mortimer departed to make the necessary arrangements, the sound of urgent knocking echoed from the street door below. Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps were followed by those of a telegraph boy whose breathless ascent of the 17 stairs spoke of considerable haste. The message he delivered bore Lestrade's compact script, but its contents sent a visible shock through both Holmes and Watson. The telegram read, "Blackwood Manor, urgent developments. Codicil discovered missing from James's room after your departure. Study re-entered despite constable on duty. Safe found open at 5 o'clock. Henderson struck unconscious on rear stair. Fresh chalk marks discovered in corridor outside study. Small circular impressions again. Require immediate assistance. Lestrade." Holmes's eyes glinted with that peculiar light Watson had learned to associate with the most dangerous phases of their investigations. "So our theatrical artist cannot resist a second performance," he murmured, folding the telegram with a sharp flick of his wrist. "The hand that staged the circle around Sir Reginald has returned to complete the deception, but in doing so has revealed the fatal flaw in an otherwise ingenious plan." Watson felt the familiar surge of anticipation that preceded their most challenging confrontations. "Holmes, if the codicil has been stolen, we may have lost our clearest indication of motive." "On the contrary, my dear fellow, its disappearance confirms the motive with mathematical precision. A document that threatens disinheritance is dangerous only while it remains undiscovered by the proper authorities. Once revealed, it becomes either evidence of guilt or proof of innocence, depending upon its contents. Someone feared what that codicil revealed, or perhaps more significantly, what it failed to reveal." Holmes moved to the window and stood gazing out at the fog-bound street, his sharp profile etched against the pale afternoon light. "We have before us not merely a locked-room murder, Watson, but something far more sophisticated, a death made to appear natural, combined with evidence designed to implicate an innocent party in a crime that was never intended to be discovered as murder at all." The great detective turned from the window with that slight smile which Watson had learned to associate with the moments when all the pieces of a complex puzzle finally aligned themselves into perfect clarity. "Fetch your service revolver, Watson. We return to Hampstead immediately, but this time we go not as investigators seeking evidence, but as hunters closing upon our quarry." As they prepared for their return journey, Holmes gathered certain items from his experimental setup. The chalked boot, a length of cord, and several chemical reagents whose purpose Watson could only guess at. The fog outside pressed more insistently against their windows, as though London itself were holding its breath in anticipation of the dramatic confrontation that the evening would surely bring. "Our opponent has made the classic error of the overly clever criminal," Holmes observed as they descended to the waiting hansom cab. "Having created one perfect deception, they could not resist the temptation to elaborate upon their masterpiece. In doing so, they have provided us with exactly the evidence we require to expose not merely the method of their crime, but the identity of the perpetrator, who has been hiding in plain sight since the very beginning of our investigation." The cab rolled away into the fog-shrouded streets, carrying them toward what Watson sensed would be the final act of this most intricate and deadly drama. The footsteps that had walked in circles around Sir Reginald Blackwood's desk were about to reveal their true origin, and with it the solution to one of the most ingeniously constructed mysteries either man had ever encountered. The hansom cab rattled through the fog-shrouded streets with renewed urgency, its wheels finding treacherous purchase on the slick cobblestones, as Holmes and Watson raced toward what promised to be the climactic confrontation of their investigation. The November evening had drawn its grey curtain across London, transforming familiar landmarks into ghostly shadows that loomed and vanished with equal suddenness. Holmes sat forward on the edge of his seat, his keen profile sharp against the passing gaslight, while his gloved hands moved restlessly over the experimental apparatus he had brought from Baker Street. "The timing of this second intrusion is most significant, Watson," Holmes observed, his voice carrying that note of intellectual satisfaction which indicated his complete mastery of the puzzle's essential elements. "Our criminal has been forced into premature action by our discovery of the codicil, and in their haste to retrieve it, they have made the fundamental error that will prove their undoing. Having created one perfect deception, they could not resist the temptation to elaborate upon their masterpiece." Watson checked his service revolver with practiced efficiency, ensuring that the chambers were properly loaded for whatever confrontation awaited them. The familiar weight of the weapon provided reassurance, though he suspected that Holmes's intellectual trap would prove more decisive than any physical force they might bring to bear. Blackwood Manor received them in a state of heightened alarm, with servants whispering in anxious clusters and constables maintaining vigilant watch over the fog-bound grounds. Lestrade met them at the entrance with the harried expression of a man whose orderly investigation had suddenly exploded into chaos, his weathered features bearing the unmistakable marks of professional frustration mixed with genuine concern. "Mr. Holmes, thank heaven you've arrived," Lestrade began without preamble, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of a seasoned investigator confronting circumstances beyond his experience. "The situation has deteriorated considerably since I sent that telegram. Henderson was discovered unconscious on the rear stair at 5 o'clock. The study has been thoroughly ransacked, and the codicil has vanished without trace." Holmes dismounted from the cab with characteristic energy, gathering his experimental materials while his sharp gaze swept the illuminated facade of the manor house. Every window blazed with light, as though the household had abandoned all pretense of normal evening routine in favor of fortress-like vigilance against further intrusion. They proceeded directly to Henderson's quarters, where the elderly valet was now conscious but clearly disoriented, his usually dignified bearing compromised by the bandage that encircled his head and the confusion that clouded his normally alert eyes. Dr. Mortimer was in attendance, his professional manner suggesting that while the injury was serious, it was not life-threatening. "Can you tell us anything about your attacker, Henderson?" Holmes inquired gently, kneeling beside the valet's bed with uncharacteristic solicitude. "It happened so quickly, Mr. Holmes," Henderson replied, his voice weak but determined. "I was ascending the rear stair to check the locks on Sir Reginald's study when something struck me from behind. I caught a glimpse of a figure moving away toward the east wing, but the blow had addled my wits too severely for clear observation. There was something familiar about the silhouette, sir, though I cannot place it with certainty. The person moved with the confidence of someone thoroughly acquainted with the house's layout. The study itself presented a scene of systematic devastation that spoke eloquently of desperate search rather than random vandalism. Books had been pulled from their shelves and scattered across the floor, desk drawers hung open with their contents spilled across the carpet, and the wall safe gaped empty like a mouth frozen in perpetual surprise. Most significantly, new chalk marks were visible upon the corridor floor outside the study door, forming small, circular impressions that seemed to mock the larger mystery of the footprints around Sir Reginald's desk. Holmes knelt beside these fresh marks, applying his magnifying glass to their examination with the same meticulous care he had devoted to the original evidence. "Observe, Watson, how these new impressions differ subtly from those we discovered this morning. The chalk composition appears identical, but the pressure and distribution suggest haste rather than the methodical precision of the original performance." Moving to the ransacked study, Holmes began a systematic examination of the scattered papers, his trained eye searching for any indication of what the intruder might have sought beyond the obvious prize of the missing codicil. It was during this search that he paused over a small brass object that lay partially concealed beneath the scattered documents near the desk. "The missing finial from the window blind," Holmes announced with evident satisfaction, retrieving the object with his handkerchief to preserve any traces it might bear. "Our theatrical artist has been careless in their haste, leaving behind the very prop that made their original performance possible." Holmes moved to the center of the devastated study and began arranging his experimental apparatus with the methodical precision that characterized all his investigations. From his collection of materials, he produced the length of cord, the chalked boot, and the brass paperweight that would serve as a substitute for the recovered finial. "Gentlemen," Holmes announced as he began his demonstration, "I propose to show you how a man need not walk to leave a man's footprints. Observe most carefully the mechanism I am about to construct." With surgical precision, Holmes attached the brass weight to one end of the cord, then secured the other end to the window frame at precisely the distance they had measured from Sir Reginald's desk to the mysterious circular track. He dusted the boot liberally with chalk, ensuring that every ridge and depression of the sole was thoroughly coated with the fine white powder. The demonstration that followed was both elegant and revelatory. Holmes guided the weighted cord in a slow, deliberate arc, allowing the chalked boot to press against the carpet at regular intervals as it traced a perfect circle around the desk chair. Each impression was uniform in depth and spacing, creating a pattern that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the mysterious evidence they had discovered that morning. "You perceive, my dear fellows," Holmes said with evident satisfaction, "that the mechanical precision of these impressions far exceeds what any human walker could achieve, even under the most controlled circumstances. Note particularly how the chalk dust concentrates within each footprint, while scarcely extending beyond its boundaries, exactly as we observed in the original crime scene." Lestrade watched the demonstration with growing comprehension, his professional skepticism giving way to grudging admiration for Holmes's deductive methodology. But Mr. Holmes, how could such a device be operated from outside a locked room? "The beauty of this particular deception, Inspector, lies in its self-operating nature. The weighted pendulum, properly positioned and released at the appropriate moment, would continue to swing in diminishing circles for several hours, gradually coming to rest in a manner that would leave no trace of the mechanism itself. A simple thread withdrawn through the keyhole after the pendulum was set in motion would complete the illusion of supernatural intervention." Holmes dismantled his experimental apparatus and turned to address the assembled company with that note of authority which indicated the beginning of serious action. "Inspector Lestrade, our adversary believes they have successfully removed the most incriminating evidence, but they have instead provided us with the means to expose their identity. I shall require your complete cooperation in setting a trap that will force our criminal into revealing themselves. We shall announce to the household that all guards are withdrawn and the study sealed for the night, creating the impression that our investigation has reached an impasse. However, you will position 2 constables you trust at the garden side beyond the windows and 1 at the far stair. You and I will maintain surveillance from a concealed position." Holmes moved to the study window and began preparing what appeared to be another mechanical device, this one designed not to create false evidence, but to detect genuine intrusion. He strung a length of cord from the curtain pole to the desk leg, adjusting the tension until a suspended boot would, when disturbed by any movement in the room, create an audible signal that would alert the hidden observers. "Our quarry will return," Holmes announced with quiet confidence, "for they are in love with their own device and cannot resist the temptation to ensure that their deception remains intact. The criminal mind, once it has achieved initial success through elaborate means, invariably seeks to perfect its masterpiece rather than abandon it for simpler methods." As the evening deepened and the fog pressed more insistently against the manor's windows, Holmes and Watson took their positions in a darkened dressing room adjacent to the corridor, where a thin panel and narrow grille afforded them a clear view of the study door and the stretch of runner where the mysterious chalk marks lay like ghostly signatures of criminal intent. The house settled into that anxious hush which precedes either disaster or deliverance, every creak and whisper magnified by the tension that permeated the fog-bound manor. Somewhere below, a clock chimed the quarter hour, its sonorous notes seeming to count down towards some inevitable confrontation that would finally resolve the mystery of the footsteps that walked in circles. Holmes's hand rested lightly upon the thread that would activate their detection device, his keen eyes fixed upon the corridor where shadows seemed to shift and dance in the uncertain gaslight. "Our opponent has made the classic error of the overly clever criminal Watson," he whispered. Having created one perfect deception, they could not resist returning to elaborate upon their work. In doing so, they have provided us with exactly the evidence we require to expose not merely the method of their crime, but the identity of the perpetrator who has been hiding in plain sight since the very beginning of our investigation. The fog outside pressed against the windows like some living thing seeking entry, while within the manor, two of London's finest investigators waited in the darkness for the final act of one of the most ingeniously constructed mysteries either man had ever encountered. The stage was set, the trap prepared, and the night promised revelations that would finally explain how footsteps could walk in perfect circles around a dead man's desk, in a room locked from within. The manor house seemed to hold its breath as the minutes crawled past midnight, the silence broken only by the distant whisper of wind against the eaves and the measured ticking of a clock somewhere deep within the east wing. Watson could feel the coiled tension in Holmes's posture where they crouched behind the thin panel, his friend's hand resting lightly upon the taut thread that connected their concealment to the suspended boot within the study. The fog pressed against the windows with renewed insistence, as though London itself conspired to shroud this final act in deeper mystery. It was precisely 23 minutes past 1 when their vigil was rewarded. The softest scrape of a key in the lock announced the arrival of their quarry, followed by the barely audible creak of hinges as the study door yielded to careful pressure. A figure slipped through the opening with the confident ease of someone intimately familiar with every aspect of the manor's layout. Yet there was something furtive in the movement that spoke of guilty purpose rather than legitimate business. Mullins, the gardener, moved through the darkened study with practiced stealth, a small lantern casting its shielded beam in careful arcs as he approached the desk where Sir Reginald had breathed his last. In his weathered hands, Watson could discern the telltale implements of deception, a canvas pouch containing French chalk, a length of cord, and what appeared to be a brass finial that gleamed dully in the lantern light. The thread beneath Holmes's fingers quivered as Mullins approached the window mechanism, his movements betraying intimate knowledge of the pendulum device that had created those mysterious circular footprints. Holmes's hand tightened in silent warning to Watson, then released the detection thread with surgical precision. The suspended boot within the study tapped sharply against the desk leg, its metallic chime echoing through the chamber like a bell tolling the end of deception. "Now!" Holmes commanded, and in an instant the study erupted into controlled chaos. Lestrade and his constables burst through the door, while Holmes vaulted through the panel opening, Watson close behind, with his service revolver drawn. Mullins spun toward the window in desperate flight, but found his escape blocked by the very mechanism he had come to adjust. Within moments, the gardener was secured, his tools of deception scattered across the Persian carpet, like evidence of some arcane ritual. "I never meant no harm," Mullins gasped, as Lestrade's iron grip found his wrist, the canvas pouch spilling its contents in a cascade of chalk and brass fittings. "I was only following orders, doing as I was told. The note said to come tonight, to make sure the device was working proper, to leave fresh marks in the corridor if anyone came asking questions." Holmes examined the recovered implements with characteristic precision, his magnifying glass revealing details that spoke eloquently of mechanical ingenuity and criminal intent. The chalk matches that found in Sir Reginald's safe, the cord bears the distinctive weave of that severed from the window blind, and this brass finial completes the pendulum mechanism that created our impossible locked room mystery. But even as Holmes spoke, his keen eyes remained fixed upon the study door, where shadows seemed to shift with more than natural movement. "Inspector Lestrade," he said quietly, "I believe our theatrical performance has attracted precisely the audience we intended. Mullins here was merely the stagehand. The true director of this elaborate production approaches even now." The words had scarcely left Holmes's lips when James Blackwood appeared in the doorway, his usually composed features bearing the unmistakable marks of a man driven to desperate action. In his hand gleamed the needle of a hypodermic syringe, its contents promising swift and permanent silence for any inconvenient witnesses. "You were instructed to be silent, Mullins," James said with cold fury, his cultured voice carrying a note of deadly intent. "Your loose tongue threatens to undo everything we have so carefully constructed." Holmes stepped forward with that slight smile which indicated his complete mastery of the situation. "Mr. James Blackwood, I had rather hoped you would join our little gathering. Your presence here tonight provides the final confirmation of what I had already deduced from the evidence accumulated during our investigation." James Blackwood's face underwent a remarkable transformation as the full implications of his exposure became clear, though he retained sufficient presence of mind to maintain his grip upon the deadly syringe. "Mr. Holmes, surely you cannot believe that I would harm my own uncle. The very suggestion is monstrous." "On the contrary," Holmes replied with unshakable certainty, "you orchestrated Sir Reginald's death with the same mechanical precision that characterized your pendulum device. The beauty of your deception lay not merely in its execution, but in its fundamental misdirection. You created the perfect room mystery, complete with impossible evidence, to conceal a murder that was never intended to appear as murder at all." Holmes moved to the window mechanism, his long fingers tracing the cord and weight system that had so successfully deceived the initial investigation. "Sir Reginald died of poison, Mr. Blackwood, a rare neurotoxin that mimics cardiac failure in elderly patients with weak constitutions. You administered this substance during one of your evening visits when the household staff had been dismissed and your uncle was alone in his study. The locked doors, the clutched key, the circular footprints, all were theatrical touches designed to create an impossible mystery that would distract from the simple truth of poisoning. Watson observed the interplay between the two men with that mixture of admiration and tension which characterized the climactic moments of their most challenging cases. The evidence was overwhelming, the logic irrefutable, yet James Blackwood's desperate grip upon his weapon suggested that the confrontation was far from concluded. "The codicil," Holmes continued relentlessly, "revealed your unauthorized use of the family name to secure substantial credit from various London establishments. Sir Reginald's investigation had uncovered the full extent of your financial irregularities, and his proposed changes to the family trust would have left you completely disinherited. You could not allow that document to reach his solicitors." James Blackwood's shoulders sagged as the weight of exposure settled upon him, though his voice retained its cultured precision even in defeat. Uncle Reginald was a stubborn old fool who refused to understand the necessities of modern life. The family fortune was stagnating under his conservative management, while I had opportunities for investment that could have tripled our wealth within a decade. Instead, Holmes observed with characteristic directness, you chose murder, elaborate deception, and the corruption of an honest working man to conceal your crimes. The pendulum device was ingenious, I grant you, but your fundamental error lay in creating evidence that was too perfect, too mechanically precise for human agency. Lestrade moved with professional efficiency to disarm James Blackwood, the hypodermic syringe clattering harmlessly to the floor as handcuffs clicked into place around the young heir's wrists. The fog outside seemed to lift slightly, as though the resolution of the mystery had somehow lightened the very atmosphere of the fog-bound manor. The footsteps that walked in circles, Holmes announced with quiet satisfaction, were never footsteps at all, but the methodical impressions of a boot suspended from a weighted cord, set in motion by a murderer who believed that elaborate deception could conceal simple truth. In my experience, gentlemen, the most complex mysteries often yield to the most elementary principles of observation and deduction. As the constables led James Blackwood away and Mullins was secured for his role in the deception, Watson found himself reflecting upon the ingenuity of the scheme they had just unravelled. The locked room, the impossible evidence, the mechanical precision of the circular footprints, all had combined to create one of the most theatrically perfect mysteries either man had ever encountered, yet it had ultimately failed because its very perfection had betrayed its artificial nature. The case of the footsteps that walked in circles was concluded, its solution a testament to the power of logical deduction applied to even the most seemingly impossible circumstances. Holmes stood beside the window where the pendulum device had once swung in its deadly arc, his keen gaze already turning toward whatever new puzzle London might provide to challenge his extraordinary abilities. The dawn that broke over Blackwood Manor carried with it the peculiar clarity that follows the resolution of long-standing mysteries, the fog lifting from the grounds as though the very atmosphere had been cleansed by the exposure of truth. Holmes stood at the study window, his sharp profile etched against the pale morning light, while behind him the evidence of James Blackwood's elaborate deception lay scattered across the Persian carpet, like the remnants of some macabre theatrical performance. Dr. Mortimer arrived with the first light, his professional bearing now unmarked by the uncertainty that had characterized his previous visit. The specialized post-mortem examination he had conducted through the night had confirmed Holmes's deductions with scientific precision, revealing traces of a rare South American neurotoxin that produced symptoms virtually indistinguishable from natural cardiac failure. The substance is known to certain native tribes as the Silent Death, Dr. Mortimer explained, his voice carrying the measured precision of medical testimony. It acts upon the nervous system to produce rapid cardiac arrest, leaving virtually no trace in the victim's system after 12 hours. In an elderly patient with pre-existing heart conditions, the symptoms would appear entirely consistent with natural causes. Holmes nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose theoretical deductions had been confirmed by empirical evidence. James Blackwood's knowledge of exotic toxicology suggests considerable preparation for his crime. Such substances are not readily available through conventional channels, and their acquisition would require both substantial financial resources and connections to very specialized dealers. Lestrade approached with the documentation of James Blackwood's complete confession, obtained during the long night hours following his arrest. The young heir had provided a comprehensive account that confirmed every aspect of Holmes's deductions, revealing the desperate financial circumstances that had driven him to such extreme measures. His unauthorized use of the family name had secured credit from no fewer than 7 London establishments, accumulating debts exceeding £20,000, a sum that represented complete financial ruin should Sir Reginald's proposed codicil reach the family solicitors. "The beauty of the deception," Holmes observed as he examined the recovered pendulum components, lay not merely in its mechanical ingenuity but in its psychological misdirection. By creating an impossible locked room mystery complete with supernatural overtones, James Blackwood ensured that any investigation would focus upon the theatrical elements rather than the simple fact of poisoning. Mullins, faced with the overwhelming evidence of his complicity, had provided a complete confession that illuminated the final details of the elaborate scheme. The gardener's involvement had begun innocently enough. James Blackwood had approached him with what appeared to be a harmless request to install a new window blind mechanism in Sir Reginald's study. Only after Sir Reginald's death had James revealed the true purpose of the device, threatening to implicate Mullins in the murder unless he cooperated in maintaining the deception. "It will be as well," Holmes announced, seating himself at the ravaged desk, "to restore sequence where confusion has been so industriously cultivated." Sir Reginald, deeply suspicious of attempts upon his papers, dusted his safe dial with French chalk, the very bottle we found within. Our adversary appropriated that same material to fashion his theatrical performance. A loop of cord was positioned beneath this door, its free end retained in the corridor, connected to the interior mechanism. At the chosen hour, after Sir Reginald had secured his bolts, our stagehand drew the external loop, which activated the weighted boot and set it swinging in perfect arcs around the desk. Watson observed the interplay of expressions that crossed the faces of their assembled audience as Holmes's explanation illuminated each element of the deception: the uniform distribution of the French chalk, the perfect regularity of the circular pattern, the complete absence of connecting footprints between impressions. Every detail proclaimed the artificial nature of the evidence, yet the theatrical perfection of the presentation had initially obscured these obvious inconsistencies. "The psychological portrait that emerges," Holmes continued, "is that of a man who had convinced himself that murder was justified by financial necessity. James Blackwood believed that his uncle's death would solve his immediate problems, while the elaborate deception would ensure that no investigation would uncover the true cause of Sir Reginald's demise." Henderson, recovering from his injuries with characteristic resilience, had provided crucial testimony regarding the evening of Sir Reginald's death. The elderly valet recalled observing James Blackwood leaving the manor at approximately 9 o'clock, claiming urgent business in London, yet returning through the servants' entrance near midnight, precisely when the pendulum device would have completed its mechanical performance and come to rest. The criminal mind, when spurred by desperation and theatrical flair, can achieve heights of invention that would put many an honest artisan to shame. Holmes reflected, his keen gaze already turning toward whatever new challenge might await them in the fog-bound streets of London. Yet for all its elaborate complexity, this deception ultimately failed because its very perfection betrayed its artificial nature. The footsteps that walked in perfect circles around Sir Reginald Blackwood's desk were too precise, too mechanically regular for human agency, and this fundamental flaw provided the key to unraveling the entire murderous scheme. The case was concluded, justice would be served, and the truth had finally emerged from beneath layers of ingenious deception. As the morning light strengthened, and the last vestiges of fog retreated from Blackwood Manor, Holmes prepared to return to Baker Street, where London's endless supply of mysteries awaited his extraordinary powers of observation and deduction. The morning light that filtered through the study windows carried with it the peculiar clarity that follows the resolution of long-standing mysteries, as though the very atmosphere had been cleansed by the exposure of truth. Holmes stood beside the recovered pendulum apparatus, his keen fingers tracing the brass finial that had served as the mechanical heart of James Blackwood's elaborate deception. The scattered evidence of the night's confrontation lay across the Persian carpet, like the remnants of some macabre theatrical performance, each piece now robbed of its mysterious power by the harsh illumination of logical explanation. Dr. Mortimer arrived with the dawn, bearing the scientific confirmation that would transform Holmes's theoretical deductions into legal certainty. His specialized examination had revealed not only traces of the exotic neurotoxin in Sir Reginald's system, but a minute puncture wound beneath the right sleeve, so small as to escape casual observation, yet sufficient to introduce the deadly substance into the victim's bloodstream. The physician's detailed analysis confirmed every aspect of Holmes's reconstruction, from the method of administration to the timing of the poison's effects. The alkaloid is derived from a South American plant known to certain tribal peoples as the Silent Death, Dr. Mortimer explained with professional precision. It acts upon the nervous system to produce rapid cardiac arrest, while leaving virtually no trace after 12 hours. In an elderly patient with pre-existing heart conditions, the symptoms would appear entirely consistent with natural causes. Lestrade departed with characteristic efficiency, escorting James Blackwood toward the justice that awaited him at Bow Street, while Mullins followed under separate guard, his weathered features bearing the unmistakable marks of a man who had discovered too late the true cost of his complicity. The inspector's parting words carried a rare note of unqualified admiration for Holmes's methodology, though Watson observed that his friend's attention had already begun to turn toward whatever new puzzle London might provide. The return journey to Baker Street unfolded in contemplative silence, the hansom cab rolling through streets where the fog had finally lifted to reveal the familiar landmarks of their daily lives. Holmes sat opposite Watson, with that peculiar mixture of intellectual satisfaction and philosophical melancholy which invariably followed the resolution of their most complex cases, his sharp profile etched against the passing gaslight as his restless mind already began organizing the evidence into the logical framework that would guide future investigations. The beauty of this particular deception, Holmes observed as their cab approached Baker Street, lay not merely in its mechanical ingenuity, but in its fundamental misdirection. By creating evidence that appeared to implicate supernatural forces, James Blackwood ensured that any investigation would focus upon the impossible rather than the merely improbable. Yet it was precisely this theatrical perfection that betrayed the artificial nature of his creation. Mrs. Hudson received them with that mixture of relief and professional curiosity which had become familiar during their years of partnership, though Watson noted that Holmes merely picked at the breakfast she had prepared, his restless energy already seeking new channels for expression now that the Blackwood case had reached its inevitable conclusion. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the person of Miss Eleanor Vance, whose pale features bore the unmistakable marks of a woman grappling with the complete destruction of her expectations for the future. She had come seeking some understanding of the man she had believed she knew, some explanation for the terrible transformation that had led to murder and elaborate deception. Holmes received her with uncharacteristic gentleness, recognizing in her distress the innocent suffering that so often accompanied the exposure of criminal behavior. "Miss Vance," he said with quiet authority, "the man you knew was real, as were the feelings he expressed for you. The criminal who poisoned Sir Reginald was born of desperation and fear, not inherent evil. Financial pressure can transform even honorable men into creatures they themselves would not recognize." Eleanor's departure left both men in contemplative silence, each reflecting upon the broader implications of a case that had demonstrated both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of moral failure. The mechanical precision of the pendulum device spoke of a mind capable of remarkable creativity, yet that same intellect had been employed in service of murder rather than legitimate enterprise. As evening approached and the familiar rhythms of Baker Street reasserted themselves, Holmes moved to his violin with renewed energy, drawing from its strings a meditative phrase that wound upon itself in gentle spirals. He paused to smile at some private conceit before observing, "Circles, Watson, are the natural geometry of minds that cannot escape themselves. The guilty, when they seek to mislead, often return to the point from which they set out, believing that perfect regularity will prove the work of fate. But nature abhors such perfection. It is the smaller symmetry, the flaw that life insists upon, which tells us that the work is human." A familiar rap at the street door below announced the arrival of London's next mystery, and Holmes set aside his instrument with a glance of amused resignation toward his friend. The case of the footsteps that walked in circles was concluded, but the great city's endless supply of puzzles awaited their extraordinary partnership in the eternal struggle between deception and truth. The familiar tread of Inspector Lestrade upon the 17 stairs interrupted the morning calm at Baker Street, bringing with it the final threads that would complete the tapestry of our understanding. The inspector's weathered features bore the satisfaction of a man whose investigation had reached its proper conclusion, though Watson observed that his professional triumph was tempered by genuine regret for the human tragedy that had necessitated their involvement. "The confession was comprehensive, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade announced as he settled into his customary chair beside the fireplace. "James Blackwood provided every detail, from his acquisition of the South American neurotoxin through contacts in the import trade to the precise calculations he employed in constructing his pendulum device. The trial will be a mere formality." Holmes nodded absently, his keen gaze already drifting toward the morning paper, though something in Lestrade's manner suggested additional revelations. The inspector produced a leather portfolio from his coat, revealing detailed mechanical drawings that spoke eloquently of the extraordinary preparation behind the deception. "Among his effects, we discovered these plans," Lestrade continued, spreading the documents across their table. "The precision is remarkable. He tested the device repeatedly in his own chambers, calculating weight distributions and arc measurements until he could predict exactly how long the boot would continue its circular motion. Every element was rehearsed, from the timing of the poison's administration to the moment when the pendulum would come to rest." Watson examined the recovered documents with growing appreciation for the complexity of the scheme they had unraveled. The pages revealed not merely mechanical drawings, but a complete psychological strategy designed to create an impossible mystery that would distract from the simple fact of murder. James Blackwood had anticipated every aspect of the investigation, yet had failed to consider that perfection itself would expose his deception. "The criminal mind," Holmes observed with characteristic insight, "often mistakes complexity for cleverness. Yet for all his preparation he failed to recognize that the human eye, when confronted with evidence that is too precise, too mechanically regular, instinctively recognizes its artificial nature. Nature abhors such geometric perfection, and so does the trained observer." The inspector's departure left both men in contemplative silence, each reflecting upon the broader implications of a case that had demonstrated the extraordinary lengths to which desperation might drive even educated individuals. The transformation of James Blackwood from respected heir to calculating murderer served as a sobering reminder that financial pressure could corrupt the most promising character. Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the gaslit street where the familiar rhythms of London were asserting themselves. Hansoms rattled past on urgent business, pedestrians hurried through the gathering dusk, and somewhere in the great city's labyrinthine streets, new mysteries were undoubtedly taking shape. The most tragic element, Holmes reflected, lies not in the mechanical ingenuity of the deception, but in its fundamental unnecessity. Had James Blackwood simply confessed his financial difficulties to his uncle, he might have found compassion, or at least a solution less permanent than murder. Instead, his shame led him to construct an elaborate edifice of deception that ultimately collapsed under its own weight. Watson found himself thinking of Eleanor Vance, whose youthful hopes had been shattered by the exposure of her fiancé's perfidy, and of Mullins, the simple gardener whose fear had made him complicit in terrible deeds. The human cost of Blackwood's ambition extended far beyond Sir Reginald's death, encompassing the ruin of several innocent lives swept into the destructive wake of his desperate act. Holmes returned to his violin, drawing from its strings a meditative phrase that seemed to weave together all the elements of their recently concluded case. The mechanical precision of the pendulum device, the desperate creativity of a cornered mind, the tragic transformation of love into betrayal, all found expression in the haunting melody that filled their sitting room. The case of the footsteps that walked in circles, Holmes said finally, setting aside his instrument, will serve as an excellent illustration of the principle that elaborate deception often defeats itself through its very complexity. The circular footprints were too perfect, too obviously the product of artificial contrivance rather than natural human movement. As evening deepened and the sounds of Baker Street settled into their customary rhythm, Watson began organizing his notes for the account that would eventually find its way to the reading public. The Blackwood case had provided a perfect example of Holmes's methods, from the initial observation of inconsistencies to the final mechanical demonstration that exposed truth behind seemingly impossible evidence. The footsteps that had walked in perfect circles around Sir Reginald Blackwood's desk would never walk again, their mechanical precision silenced forever by the exposure of truth. Yet somewhere in the fog-bound streets of the great city, new puzzles were already taking shape, new mysteries preparing to challenge the extraordinary abilities of the world's first consulting detective, and the eternal struggle between deception and truth would continue its ancient dance through the gaslit shadows of Victorian London.